Hey friends, this is Pastor Brian Savage, Senior Pastor at Heritage Church, and I want to welcome you back to another episode of Beyond the Sermon. Hey, we have a lot to get through today, so let's welcome our guest, the one, the only, Pastor Josh Howard. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing okay, man.
All right.
Doing really good.
So I just got word that all of the Texas Rangers starting pitching they're on the DL.
Yeah,
and
you sit on the throne of lies.
Oh, no, this was fresh in. You just haven't seen it yet.
No, I don't believe it.
Okay,
I don't believe
right.
you're telling me the truth at all.
Well, I tried.
Let's stop the podcast. Well, Josh, on that note, how are your Cardinals doing this spring?
Well, they're under 500, and we'll see.
So the age-old question, does spring training really matter?
The results of the games do not matter at all. The results of individual players could matter. Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Well, I would just like to say that my Texas Rangers won the World Series last year, and they're still looking pretty good this spring.
It's
So
funny, but I've been on this podcast several times now, and you mention that every single time.
I just love it. Every time I see you, I just need to remind you that the Texas Rangers won the World Series.
I mean, I feel like that you have fair game to do that all the way until they don't.
Hey,
again,
look, here's the deal.
So-
I've been rooting for them for 43 years of my
Absolutely.
life. They
Absolutely.
never won the World Series.
Gotta-
I get 1 year to celebrate.
That's right. That's right. You gotta live it up.
Well, speaking of celebration, we're not too far away from Easter Sunday. And man, one of my favorite times of the year. And personally, I'm just really looking forward to Easter this year. Can't wait for that day of celebration. So, Josh, we're in this series, The Road to Calvary. We've literally just been going systematically through each story of the last just week or two of the life of Christ and looking at everything that led Jesus towards his death and resurrection. And so, yeah, we get to an interesting spot this weekend. So, we've been on this journey. He was headed towards Jerusalem. He gets to Jerusalem. People start worshiping him as the king of Jerusalem. He goes and overthrows the corruption that's happening in God's temple, and he's kind of proving that he's the high priest of God's temple. And then he's proving that he is also the Prince of Peace in the hearts of God's children. The Pharisees try to trap him over and over. He remarkably doesn't engage in any of those traps and continues to prove over and over that he is the king, he is the Messiah, he is our Savior. And so the week before last, we got to a really interesting part of the story where Jesus really starts talking about end-time prophecies. And I had your dad on the podcast last week, and just he did a phenomenal job. He is just such a wealth of knowledge with end-time prophecy. And so that leads us to where we get to the story today. So, we left Jesus where he was still in the temple, and he was telling his followers and his disciples about the end times and how they should live, knowing that the end is coming soon. And then we really start getting into some major things that very quickly turned the narrative for Jesus and really escalated things towards his impending death. So we started today with the really unfortunate scenario where Judas betrays Jesus. And, Satan, what we read today was that Satan entered Judas, really began to influence Judas, where he completely turned his back on Christ by accepting an offer of blood money, honestly. And man, there's a lot to talk about there. Now, I will say the message today, man, we had a lot to get through because I was talking about the initial betrayal, and then we get straight into the Lord's Supper. So let's do this, Josh. How about we just start with this very first point? And I would love for you to take us deeper with just this betrayal of Judas. So really in today's message, when we're reading about the story of Judas's fall and how Satan inhabited him and really started turning his heart and his thoughts. Josh, let's start there, man. Anything you would just want to add to the betrayal of Jesus from Judas?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing when I was reading that passage back, the first thing that jumped out at me was none of this was a surprise to Jesus. So, I mean, even honestly, when Judas was first called as a disciple, Jesus knew what he was getting into. And I guess one of the very first things that I marvel at with Jesus, and I marvel at a lot with him, but was was how he treated Judas as a co-equal disciple all the way through the journey, even though he knew that betrayal was coming. And even more than that, like, and we'll get into this in a minute, but one of Judas's responsibilities for the crew was to keep track of money, and that's hopefully a high trust type position. And so the fact that that was given to him, the fact that he was allowed to journey, the fact that from all we know of all of the interactions, Jesus treated him with an equal amount of dignity and honor and respect, even though. And I just don't. This is just me being human. I just don't know that I would have or could have done it.
I don't know too many people who, if you knew the future, if you knew that someone that you were highly investing in as a friend or even a spouse, whatever that is, and you knew going into it that they were going to not only in this case betray you and turn their back on you, but actually would become the person that would lead to your own death. I mean, it's pretty remarkable, the heart of Christ, when you just pull back that layer and just Christ knew that would happen, yet he still loved him unconditionally, still invited him to the table, still invited him to be a part of his inner circle. That's remarkable.
It is. Yep. It is. The other thing, and you actually kind of opened the door to this in your sermon, but the other thing that was striking about this particular part of Judas's story, you mentioned the Gospel of John and how John really has a few different moments that kind of give you a sense that this was the direction that things were heading. And so I think you even mentioned John 12, but there's this just great story where, John gives us a little bit of background where, there's this situation where, who's it? Mary comes and wants to break open a really expensive jar of perfume. And Judas was the one that was kind of like, why are you doing this? He says this perfume's worth a year's wages. Like, why are you using it for this purpose? And Jesus's response was great. Leave her alone. She did this in preparation for my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you'll not always have me. But then we get this really interesting little snippet of information about Judas where it says, not that he cared for the poor. He was a thief, and since he was in charge of the disciples' money, he often stole some for himself. And, it's interesting, because this is late in the game. This is John 12. So this is like right before John 13 kind of kicks into the very last moment that Jesus has with his disciples. And we get that insider view there, but it does give this sense that there were decisions made on behalf of Judas, or concessions made or compromises made that opened the door for Satan to enter in. And so I was glad that you mentioned that, because I do think that there's value in just taking a look at the fact that there are certain things that we can open the door in our lives to, kind of a slow burn kind of thing, that all of a sudden then the trap is snared and we find ourselves, at the other end of blood money, betraying our best friend.
That's right. It's interesting because when you go to the Gospel of John and you start reading passages like that, to me, it's always been a reminder, like I've had people ask before, how did Judas get to this place where he knew that with this betrayal that Christ would probably be executed? How does someone get to that place? Well, you get to that place because there's this slow inbreaking of sin, right? And you start getting used to that sin. So maybe for Judas, it started with just being dishonest. And then that dishonesty led to stealing the money that was for the disciples and for Jesus to live off of. And then that went to, who knows, maybe pride. Maybe he wanted to be in this place of Jesus. So, I mean, when you look at very gregarious, is that the right word? Sins, or atrocious, whatever, nasty sins, and you think to yourself, man, how does someone get there? Well, it starts just like it started with Judas. It's a slow inbreaking to just living a sinful life, and then you get used to it. And I think that's what the Gospel of John is trying to show with Judas.
Yeah. And it's also interesting that both in the Gospel of John, chapter 12, and then this situation, money seems to be at the root. So it's, Satan, he knows what he's doing. Unfortunately, he's a strategist, and he knows us, he understands us. And so he will continue to toggle that particular, repetitive, habitual sin in our life until we button it up. And even then, we'll still go back to it in different ways. And I think it's just good for us to be aware.
Absolutely.
So, and I don't know if we want to get into it because I know we've got a lot of other things to talk about, but the question that I would kind of have out of it, and maybe this is just more for reflection as people engage with this, is what are some things that we need to have in our life that will help us identify those patterns of sin or the slow fall, the slow burn?
Yeah.
What are some things that
Let's
we
talk
need
about
to...
it. What would be some of your thoughts on that, Josh?
I think accountability is huge. I have an accountability partner. Right now we meet monthly because it's over Zoom and it's distance, but we'll ask each other questions and really sort of dive in on some of those issues. One thing that I've been doing recently that's been really fruitful is to use what's called the prayer of examine. And so this is like just an every 24-hour kind of thing. I'll usually journal this because this is helpful to me and it sort of gives me a record of this. But the two questions that I really interact with are, where in the last 24 hours have I felt God's presence in the most profound way? And then kind of give him praise for that. But then I try to circle through my day and identify what are those places where I felt maybe I missed the boat or I didn't feel his presence as a part of it. Like what are those things that maybe I need to go before him with? And so that's been a regular thing. But I also think setting good boundaries, if you know that this is an issue, like if you know money is an issue, setting safeguards around, maybe you don't handle the money. Maybe you give that to Peter, or you give that to somebody else. But then the other thing is really surrounding yourself with good, trusted sources of godly wisdom and listening, like being honest. Like I feel like some people are afraid to ask the kind of the critical question of like, what are you seeing in me that's a blind spot? But then the other danger of asking that question is when you get the answer to not get defensive immediately and to really try to learn from it. And so those are just a couple of things that I was thinking this week is like, and that's not to say, I don't know, Judas was around godly people the whole time. So these are safeguards. These aren't like guarantees. They're still personal accountability and responsibility and those sorts of things. But I wonder if those things would be helpful for us.
I think when we talk about Judas, I mean, man, it's such a challenging passage when I believe it's verse 3 when it says, "Then Satan entered Judas." And there's a lot of debate on this, and sometimes I've heard people argue, well, there's got to be a lot of grace for Judas. I mean, if the top dog of evil, we're not just talking about a demon, but we're talking about Satan himself entered someone. I've heard people say, well, surely there was grace from God with Judas. And maybe there is. We don't know. It's God judges, not us, right? We don't know how that's going to play out. But I would also say, just based on what you said, though, in my opinion, there was a way out for Judas. There was a way out. He was surrounded by these godly men, and he was in the presence of God himself. And had he verbalized his sin, had he said to someone, Jesus, can you help free me of this? I think there would have been freedom waiting for him. I know there would have been, because Jesus would have cast that out. But I think the problem was that he fed on it. He welcomed it in, and there was something about that power and that greed and love for money that he just wasn't willing to turn away from. Yeah. So what I would say is to anyone, if you feel like Satan has a stronghold over you, I believe Scripture says there is always a way out. And I love what you just talked about. There's several ways out for Judas: accountability, examine boundaries, getting input. It's really good. Josh, in today's message, so after, and that's what I love about the Gospel of Luke, he just kind of gives us this little nugget of, hey, here's what's going on in the background with Judas. Now back to the story, right? And so from there, we get straight to the Passover meal and the Last Supper. Man, we could probably talk an hour or two just on this. But Josh, is there anything really pressing on your heart that you'd like to unpack around the Last Supper?
Yeah, yeah, and this will probably take a little bit, but first, I want to just commend you because I think that connecting the dots with Passover is so important. And I remember, and I'll refer to this in a minute, but I remember probably 3 or 4 times in my life having like the Chosen People ministry come in and do the whole Messiah in the Passover presentation, and just how powerful it is to recognize all of the cups and all of the order and the horseradish and the sour and the bitterness of it, all of those different elements. And you just did such a great job of unpacking all of that. And I just think it really, it cannot be overstated how much Jesus is foreshadowed in the Passover.
Absolutely.
And it's just it's so beautiful.
It is.
And
to think that tradition started in Old Testament times, thousands of years before Christ was even on the scene here on earth, but that it was all purposely set aside by God to point to the one. Yeah.
And isn't that, I know this is a riff, this is a dovetail, but the scriptures are just chock full of those threads that are set up. It's in some ways, because I love a good story that does that. And, maybe a thread gets buried in the beginning and then it doesn't get picked up till the end and it makes sense of the whole thing. And that's how I feel like the scriptures are, particularly Jesus, where it's like all of these threads get established, but it's Jesus that makes sense of them all. It's like they all pull tight just as soon as he comes on the scene. And it's just a beautiful thing. But okay, so what I wanted to kind of talk through today, it's actually something I've shared with Heritage before, but it's been like 5 years. But it's actually out of a project that I did. And honestly, you probably wrote this same paper. Because we both
went to the same university, same seminary.
We did.
That's right.
Did you have Brandon Hancock?
I did.
Okay, so you probably did. Well,
you might be able to do a deep research on the internet on this topic with my name and find my paper somewhere.
Okay, there you go. There you go. So, but he had us write a sacrament paper, and it was actually probably the 2 papers that I appreciated the most, because he had us really do an opinion piece on both baptism and communion. And so with communion, with any paper, you're trying to come up with something that will impress the prof and, get the good grade or whatever. And so he really wanted us to pin down, do the actual elements mean anything? Like what you actually use for the elements, does it mean anything? And, as a good Wesleyan, I can't really say, alcohol, non-alcohol, we don't use what Jesus used in the Wesleyan church. So I can't really come down hard on the wine, but for whatever reason, I came down really hard on the bread in my paper. And I remember one particular thing. I remember Chosen People ministry came in to my last church in Wheaton and did the presentation, talked about the unleavened bread being a deal and part of just the whole thing. And I remember several people coming up to me afterwards and saying, "We can never use leaven in our bread for communion ever again, ever again." And so it might have been that trauma that influenced the writing of this paper. but that's what I argued was really you should use unleavened bread all the way through. And so I turned in the paper thinking, like, oh my gosh,
Yeah, it's
you're
so
so smart,
smart.
Howard. And
You're going to ask me to teach the next class.
they are, yeah. It's a no brainer. They're going to let me just skip. I'll just get my doctorate through
That's
this
right.
paper.
That's right.
And so Brandon Hancock comes back, and he always did. I appreciated this, but he always did audio feedback, and so he'd give like a half an hour almost of like feedback. And one of the things that he said to me that I'll never forget, and it's just kind of shaped the way that I look at communion now, is the whole idea that the unleavened bread was very purposeful for Israel in that they didn't have time to wait for the leaven to settle for Passover. They had to get the heck out of town. And so, and even if you go to Exodus, you go and read some of that, you'll see it all there. Like it's even built into the instructions. Don't use leaven. You don't have time for it. You're going to need to leave really quickly. And so he's like, so keep that in mind. That's the purpose of unleavened bread for Passover. And he's like, would Jesus have used unleavened bread for communion? Yeah, probably, because he was celebrating Passover with his disciples. But then he's like, but then you have to remember something, that this is a trilogy of meals, not a duology of meals. And that you've got Passover, you've got Last Supper, and Jesus gives us permission to think this way, and you talk about this. We always have to keep the third
meal.
Yeah, the third meal in mind.
That's right.
Which is the marriage supper of the Lamb.
And that's the best one of them all.
It's going to be the best one of them all.
Absolutely.
And so what the professor was really arguing is, will there be urgency in new creation? Like, the same reason that, that caused God to say, don't use leaven in Passover. Will we be chased by an enemy? Will we be fleeing for our lives? Will we be, maybe, getting to the Red Sea and feeling like there's no way, all of that stress, will that be part of the marriage supper of the Lamb? And the answer is an emphatic no, because everything's going to be set right at that point. And Jesus will, And so I love this because it sort of gives us permission to re-examine, and even like I've even really I've never had the guts to pull the trigger on this before. Maybe we can do it sometime, but almost like a choose your own adventure bread like station, where it's like, what do you need devotionally and in this moment? What do you need most? Do you need the urgency of the Passover? Like maybe you've been apathetic in sharing your faith, or there's some area of your life that you need a fire lit under you. And so you grab the unleavened bread to remind yourself of the urgency of the first meal. But some of us are just tired. And we've been living in a dynamic where it feels like we've been fleeing for our lives for a long time. And we need to grab the leavened bread and remember about the future meal that we're going to have in heaven with Jesus, the culmination of all things. There will be no hurry. There will be no stress. There will be no weeping, no crying, no more death. All of those things will be resolved. And we're just going to be able to enjoy our company in the fullness of love. And we can take our time. And there's no reason to feel that urgency then. So I don't know, that's something that's just stuck with me. And notice I didn't get into the alcohol, non-alcohol issue at all. We're going to just stick with the leaven. But
what bread would you have out if you wanted to picture yourself at the third meal, the marriage supper? What would you have out there?
Oh man. I mean, I'm a sucker for that like really great Texas Roadhouse bread.
Oh my gosh. I'll tell you this, if we serve Texas Roadhouse rolls for communion around here,
I know
we would have to go to 6 service format.
It's bad. Yeah. There is actually and maybe you've experienced this before, but there was a lady attached to Heritage many, many years ago. She's passed away since, but she used to make like sugar bread for communion. And so she would chop it up into cubes and it was like the best bread that I have ever had. This was like back in the 90s. And I'm like, that is new creation bread right there. That's what it's going to taste like. So
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. Josh, I love that idea, man. That's incredible. It brings a whole nother element to the Lord's Supper, and an element of partaking in that based on where you currently are and maybe what you're needing or hoping for from the Lord.
yeah, it was interesting. Yeah, I was really happy for, again, going back to that whole critical, to receive that without getting defensive and realizing like, oh man, you had a way better understanding of this whole thing than I did, and to learn from it, really helpful. So yeah. Um, one other thing to add about communion, and that is just, and I think again, I know that I overquote this guy, but I read a quick statement from N.T. Wright that just said,
Oh, I thought you were going to
you know,
quote me. I'm sorry.
"Oh well, yeah." I heard a great quote from Dr. Savage,
Totally joking.
and he was like, "Oh yeah."
Oh yeah.
But what he said was really interesting to me. He's like, Jesus, for that Last Supper moment, he could have done a number of things. He could have given the disciples a theory. Instead, he gave them a meal. And the meal engages all five senses and teaches every bit of that atonement theory that you would need. And it actually happens to be something that is both a teaching instrument, but also like it was always meant to be done in community. So it brings the church together. There's no hierarchy at the communion table. We all enter as sinners that need this bread and this juice desperately, or wine. We need it. We need it desperately. And so I don't know. I love that idea. Like, of all the things he could have given him, he gave him a meal, and that's pretty special.
It is
So,
special. And how that foreshadows to the great marriage supper, right? Another meal. I just love that. I love that so much. So, Josh, this was man, this was no pun intended, a very meaty message, and man, I had to get through a lot. I mean, it starts with the betrayal, and then all of the elements of the Lord's Supper, and helping identify how that correlates to the Passover meal. But I still wanted to do it because I wanted to get through all of the passage. But I ended with another little part there, the very ending of the Lord's Supper. So let me ask you this. The last segment then of this week's scripture, it sort of had some countercultural leadership advice from Jesus, that the greatest should take the lowest position. Let's just revisit that, and any thoughts you'd want to take us deeper on that.
yeah. So I mean, let's talk about a passage that you could turn into a full series. Like, I mean, it's amazing. But
I felt horrible because I had all of like 3 minutes to talk about this,
right,
just
right,
out of time. But,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, but that when it's nestled next to communion, like that's the hard part. But yeah. One of the very first things I think of when I think of this story is the Beatitudes, and you think of just those statements, those counter-cultural statements of humility and peace, and I don't know. I've heard it called the upside down way of God, where he just turns the whole world on its head and demonstrates a new way. And I think this comes up a lot. In fact, I feel like it's come up several times, even in this sermon series with you. But just this idea of what does the world think a king looks like, and what does Jesus demonstrate that a king should look like and act like? And he just flips the whole thing. The whole script is flipped it upside down. And even I mean, next week the next couple of weeks we'll start talking about Peter and his betrayals and some of those things. And attached to that is probably a little bit of expectation that Jesus was going to be a political figure, a warrior, a David-like thing. And for that to not happen was, I'm sure, disappointing to the folks that sort of ascribed to that. But but here is Jesus modeling that, um, what I think it's the Gospel of John that talks about this, like, when the Son of Man is lifted up. And, you think, humanly, when he's lifted up, like in his glory, his, on a throne, and the whole time he's talking about the cross, and just flips the script. So I, I guess, maybe one of the things that I was thinking through with this is just, maybe trading some stories on how has this been modeled for us? Maybe, is there a leader, in either of our lives that modeled this really well for us, that kind of demonstrated Jesus, as it relates to humility and grace and those sorts of things.
I'm happy to go first on this. And this might surprise you a little bit, but some people know this, some people don't. But one of the greatest mentors in my life has actually been your father. And Pastor Tim is just a very, very special man to me. And his humility. We've known each other since around 2012, and there was just an immediate connection with us. And he was just one of those that, from the moment I met him, there was just something about him that I wanted to get to know him more. I wanted to be like him, and just his humility, his love, and his compassion have just completely changed my life. And I would tell you, my experience with Tim is he is a phenomenal leader, but one of the most humble and genuine people I know. So,
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to argue with years and years and years of lifting people up higher than yourself, and that is what he's done. Um, and I've told people, because occasionally you'll get the question, yeah, I mean, he's not that way at home, right? Like he's right, that it's too good to be true. And I'm really glad to report that, what you see is what you get with my dad. And he is humble. I mean, we're all a little bit different at home, but he was always very gentle with me. Always a mentor figure. Yeah, just a beautiful human being. Um, and yeah, yeah, that's cool. Yeah.
now what about you? You're going to say my dad, aren't you?
Yeah.
Randy Savage, Macho Man.
He
If people don't know, my dad's name is actually Randy Savage. So.
Yep. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
No, you've never met him, so
I have not.
It can't be my dad.
I haven't met either Randy Savage. You know what? I mean, and I not to show disrespect to my dad, because he would definitely be one of the answers, but you stole it from me.
Absolutely. That's why I got to go first.
But that's right. That's right. But I would say there was a dude who lived in Wheaton. And
I thought you were going to say there was a dude who lived in a van down by the river, but I didn't know where you're going with that.
There probably have been many. But this guy, his name was Med Bailey, and he actually. So I was a senior pastor of a real small church, about 100 people in Chicagoland area, before coming to Heritage, and this guy was a retired pastor at the church. Now, there were several retired pastors at this church, and so that was sometimes a really good thing and sometimes a challenging thing. But in this case, Med Bailey was a retired pastor who actually was the senior pastor of that same church 2 pastors ago, and led the church really well. And so there, you would think there could be a lot of ways that you could leverage your capital. And when they started attending Wheaton, they always supported me publicly. They always encouraged me publicly. And Med took it upon himself to meet with me privately once a month, just to speak life into me. And he was a very gentle, kind man. Didn't say anything loudly at all. In fact, I had to be strategic about where we went. Otherwise I wouldn't actually hear him. But I remember him, in terms of even me, because that was the first place that I really was developing as a preacher. He was one of the first ones to say, Josh, you have to develop your own preaching voice. You can't be John Bray. You can't be John Maxwell. You can't be, Erwin McManus. You have to be Josh Howard. And was really the first one to kind of give me confidence that I had something to say in the type of voice that I have. But he could have tried to make me into his image. But he took a very humble, loving mentorly approach. And I'll never forget it. He's since passed away as well. But I'll never forget his humble leadership and his humble mentorship in my life, which, I mean, Med Bailey and my dad, very similar in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
You would have really, I don't know if you ever met Med.
I didn't.
But you would have loved him. So
That's
yeah,
awesome.
He's a good guy. Good dude down by the river. So, yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Josh, this was awesome, man.
It was fun. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for taking us deeper. Just, man, you're just such a wealth of knowledge, my friend. And thank you, as always. Thank you just for your love for heritage, your dedication to this church. And it's an honor to have you on my staff, man.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Will you come back again?
If you invite me, I'll come back
next week.
I will do it next week.
Okay.
Yes.
Sounds
I'll
good.
be back.
Awesome. Hey, friends, I want to thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Beyond the Sermon. Hey, do me a quick favor. Like this podcast, share it with your friends. We would just love for more people to learn about what we talked about here today. Hey, love you so much. Look forward to seeing you back here next week. Go in peace.